Story 1, 27th Constitutional Amendment. According to Dawn's editorial larger discussion, the proposed 27th Amendment is not a small tweak. It's a radical restructuring of Pakistan's highest judicial institution. The bill seeks to create a new Federal Constitutional Court, FCC, shift a large part of the Supreme Court's constitutional jurisdiction to this FCC, and alter the senior court's leadership structure. The editorial cautions that such sweeping reforms demand transparent debate, not just political maneuvering. Let's dive into deeper analysis with CSS perspective. If the Supreme Court's role is diluted, Pakistan risks undermining the apex court's ability to act as a check on government power. This is a crucial point in CSS governance and public policy topics. Institutional legitimacy. The editorial argues that real reform requires more than just legal changes. There must be broad-based discussion across political parties and within the judiciary. Without consensus, these changes could fracture institutional legitimacy. Democratic maturity. Dawn warns that Pakistan's democratic maturity is being tested. Rather than forcing through reform, the government and judiciary must show restraint and transparency. This is highly exam-relevant when discussing how constitutional reform should ideally work in a democratic system. Your insight for CSS answers. In your CSS essay, focus on how such an amendment isn't just about reorganization. It's a test of Pakistan's democratic institutions. Emphasize judicial independence, constitutional debate, and institutional legitimacy. These are deeper arguments that go beyond just power grab. Story 2, Credit Surge, Economic Demand versus Real Investment. In the editorial Credit Surge, Dawn highlights that private sector borrowing in Pakistan has soared. The first 4 months of the current fiscal year saw 806.3 billion rupees in new loans, a dramatic jump from a much smaller base in the same period last year. This surge is being driven by a drop in policy rates from 22% to 11% and improving macroeconomic indicators, such as a more stable exchange rate and a narrow current account deficit. However, Dawn warns this borrowing spree is not necessarily a real sign of economic revival. Without structural reforms, this could just be speculative credit, not investment in productive sectors. Let's analyze more with CSS perspective. Risk versus opportunity. While large credit inflows may signal revived confidence, Dawn suggests that much of this could go into debt servicing, unproductive assets, or speculative ventures if the underlying business environment isn't improved. This is critical for CSS aspirants studying economy of Pakistan. Policy rate impact. The editorial links the credit boom to a sharply reduced policy rate, but warns that credit alone can't generate real growth unless accompanied by reforms in industry, infrastructure, and governance. Sustainability issue. Long-term, true economic revival requires investment. CSS candidates should note how Dawn places emphasis not just on growth, but on sustainable, institutional reforms to channel credit into real economy. Your insight for CSS answers. When writing about this, frame your argument around credit growth versus structural reform. Explain that while borrowing is up, without reforms in governance, regulatory environment, and industrial capacity, this credit surge risks fueling debt rather than development. Story 3, Terrorism returns to capital terrorism. Dawn reports that a suicide bombing killed 12 people at the G11 District Court complex in Islamabad, marking a shocking return of terrorism to the federal capital. The attack is not just a criminal incident, the editorial argues. It's a wake-up call about Pakistan's weakening security architecture and the limits of its counter-terror strategy. Analyzing more deep with CSS perspective. Internal security risks. For CSS students, this is a textbook case. Terrorism isn't just rural or border-based anymore. It has struck in the hub of judicial authority, showing how internal security challenges persist at the heart of the state. State capacity and governance. This attack highlights potential intelligence failures, or at least a lack of preventive strategy. Dawn suggests that safeguarding the state's institutions must be more than reactive. It needs a proactive, capacity-building approach. Public trust and rule of law. If such attacks keep happening, public trust in the state's ability to protect its people suffers. For essays and policy answers, This can be tied to the need for more robust counter-terror mechanisms backed by stronger institutional oversight. Your insight for CSS answers. Don't just write about the bombing as an event. Analyze its deeper meaning. It shows where Pakistan's security gaps are, in intelligence, in protecting judicial centers, and in long-term institutional reform. Use this to argue for proactive governance and capacity building.